Hi all, I have a totally amazing and inspiring positional game to show you of Leela. This is against Fire in the mighty TSEC Season 14 Premier Division. So massive hardware for all competitors. The opening book, so Leela playing white, the opening book given is a positional opening, as in, when I say positional, the pawn structure can be a big important feature for restricting pieces in more positional openings, in my view. That's one way I think of positional versus tactical openings. So here we have a classic Queen's Gambit declined, and now this move c6. This is in the opening book. e3, knight bd7, bishop d3, d takes, bishop takes c4, b5. This is the end of the book. And you might think, well, what does actually this book line represent? Why is black playing b5? One of the ideas generally is for this bishop to be active on this diagonal. It's important that it remains active, because otherwise this is extremely controversial, this pawn structure. If a blockade square, if the c5 blockade square is used here, the bishop will become a prisoner within this pawn structure, and Leela will really show it's going to be dominant in positional openings if AB engines don't really have respect for their bishops in particular, because the bishops are very predictable. They're on the same color throughout the game. So if you get a clever pawn structure which restricts the opponent's bishops, then that's a very good thing. So here we see bishop d3, bishop b7, Leela castles a6, and now Leela voluntarily gives up the dark square bishop. This dark square bishop isn't so fantastic in this pawn structure. It's not an open position with an open center. The power of the bishop pair here isn't so great, but also black's dark square bishop will be facing granite. White's center is quite solid here, and the knights really want to try and work against the bishops here. So it's a very interesting imbalance indeed, just giving up this bishop voluntarily without even waiting for h6. So we have knight takes f6. Traditional evaluations of AB engines might even give favor now to the bishop pair, because usually they're seen as advantageous, but it really depends on the pawn structure, how much of a restraining influence that is going to be on the pieces. So we have knight e4, and the knight is poised for that c5 square. Black castled here. An interesting alternative is to actually take on e4 and commit to f5, which looks terribly weakening and committal, but if black can get in c5, then this bishop is liberated. And the price of liberation, when the shackles of a positional bind can sometimes be broken out of early, is less usually than later. The longer you leave positional binds, the more you might have to sacrifice to unbind later, as a general principle. Now here, this price of liberation isn't entirely fatal, it seems. White has a small edge, but maybe black's got some chances here. In the game, black castled. We have rook c1, and it does echo that this bishop is starting to get worried. It's saying, what are my future career prospects here in this position, in this pawn structure? Am I going to be completely restrained? Okay, so we have the move knight d7. Again, this is an opportunity in this position to play knight takes e4, and say queen c7, h6. Here, this position though, white still is doing very well actually here in this kind of scenario. So it's a little bit late actually for knight takes e4. It's not actually that great now. This bishop is a prisoner. If we look instead, knight e5 is the most torturous move, by the way. in such a position, when the opponent's pieces are restricted, the last thing you want to do is give the opponent any counterplay. And if you're sometimes taking some material like here, it might not be immediately evident, but here's a variation which shows that knight e5 might actually be stronger. So say the bishop retreats, there's queen a5 all of a sudden, hitting a2 and hitting the queen, and then bishop b4, and then black can take on e4, take on c1, take on a2, and that's just totally ruining everything. Black hasn't got any problem pieces or anything. So within this variation, the way to play it is actually to keep a lock and key on the opponent's pieces with knight e5. Yeah, and this just seems to just guarantee a nagging edge. So anyway, knight takes e4 wasn't played anyway. We have knight d7, a3, and Leela's not so subtle about things here. This idea of clamping down on c5 is pretty evident, and black should be concerned strategically about the bishops, yeah, and their prospects. We have the move g6. Here you might consider two things. a5 just to literally stop b4. This isn't seen as a very good move. Queen c2, for example, has implications for h7. So say h6, moving the h7 pawn away. Knight e5. This position, white's getting a small edge. That bishop's not very happy here. And yeah, it's the queen can't take because knight takes b7. It's a nice edge for white. More energetic and radical f5 in this position. And actually, for example, if knight c5, black might see at least the dark square bishop being useful on the diagonal. And here is just a fictional game example. Within positional games, the variations aren't so concrete. We're just doing it to get a flavour of things. If this bishop, as an example, could be useful, and it seems, you know, it might actually be useful, but white's still better in this kind of scenario. But at least the bishop, the dark square bishop, isn't dead. So we have g6 though here, b4. This is starting to look like bad news. Yes, in Simple Chess by Steen, one of Britain's earliest grandmasters, who was a sort of second to coach, second to Korchnoi in his match against Karpov. So Steen wrote this book, Simple Chess, and he said the fundamental constraint on the pieces is the pawns. And here we can see that evidently that the bishop on b7 is looking less happy. a5, we have queen d2, rook a7, rook f d1, a takes, queen a8, and now knight c5. Yes, the pawn structure is now changing, and this bishop is not very happy. Sometimes, in some games, for example, Levon Aronian sometimes plays with a bishop which he tries to swap off early with bishop a6, you know, b4 and bishop a6. That might not be happening here though. Okay, we have rook a2. It might not actually, it's very difficult to try and do that here in this particular scenario, because the c6 pawn is a big liability. Anytime the bishop moves off, then there's bishop e4 and knight e5. So anyway, we have rook c2 here, rook a3, h4, queen a5, queen e2, bishop f6. Yeah, this h pawn, you might think, well, what's this in relation to anything? In fact, this is news for me. This use of the form pawn in this positional opening is like adaptive to the needs and the philosophy of this positional opening, which is to restrain the opponent's pieces. This bishop on b7 has been restrained. What if the form pawn, like cats, changing the colour of their fur, you know, to match the environment fur? The form pawn in this climate, in this environment, what if it will play a role to restrict the dark square bishop? That would be a turn up for the books, wouldn't it? We have h5. It's far too dangerous to take on h5 here. If g takes, knight e5, bishop d7, queen takes h5, for example. This scenario is too dangerous for black. This is just a fictional scenario. With the rook on d1, it turns out black can never really take on e5. So say bishop f6, I'll just show that. This is good for white, but if black ever dares take on e5 with a queen on h5, for example, rook d7 is crushing. Black would have to give up the exchange here and be in a lost position. So these are very, very dangerous scenarios. It's not afforded by the position to take on h5. So we have queen c7. So the dreaded form pawn is installed, but the cat here, the form pawn, is in a different country. In this country, it's all about destroying the opponent's bishops. It's playing actually already an interesting role in restricting the bishop a little bit. So let's see how that role increases now. Rook f8, bishop e4, rook a1, rook cd2, rook a3. Black has that activity, but it's a bit token, this activity. It's without activity without targets is just not that much of a concern. We have g3, which is quite a nifty idea for king g2 to be able to use the h-file sometimes. Bishop d8, and also of course protect the form pawn if needed. So the rook goes back. Black is not doing too much. Knight e5. We have bishop e7, and now queen g4, and all of a sudden there are tactical implications now. Concrete tactical implications of taking on g6, as you might suspect, because actually this pawn is also acting right now as an attacking piece. Kasparov said pawns around the opponent's king are almost like worth attacking pieces. Black reacts with bishop f6 here. If rook a2, as we can see that bishop takes g6, is actually pretty dangerous. For example here, that h-pawn is actually winning. It's not even about checkmate. The queen doesn't need anything. It's just the h-pawn's winning there. So, and otherwise, if king h8, then queen g7. And even earlier, black can't do anything here. If bishop f6, then it turns out this king g2 from earlier is very handy here for h7 check to be even more effective. Queening and then checkmating with rook h1. So that's pretty handy stuff, that the king's on g2 ready for this h-file use in this variation. So this is pretty ominous tactically. So black plays bishop f6. Now the white rooks are really ready to punish down this d-file, especially with the form pawn now, that goal hanging pawn. There's sometimes mating possibilities because the escape square is covered of the king, and so taking on e5 is less desirable sometimes. Now we have bishop going back. Yeah, so the bishop went back. Rook a3. Concretely, if bishop takes e5, for example, just put it on the board, rook d8 is checkmating. You can see that the form pawn is delivering a goal. Goal, checkmate. So rook a3, rook d3, rook takes. Rook takes. Again, it's too dangerous to take on e5 here. If bishop takes e5, takes here, the rook enters, and then, for example, that's checkmate. If the bishop moves, then the entry is hitting f7. That's celebrated with queen f3, which also hits c6. And now there's a big passed pawn. This is just a very big advantage for white. This scenario, because of the form pawn and the passed c pawn, is actually winning. For example, like this, there's no time for black to use the b pawn. It's end of game, that scenario. It's actually pretty concrete as well, actually, this variation. So queen e7 is played. We have knight f3, bishop drops to c8, as though e5. The queen gets out of the way in advance and locks down e5, bishop d7. And now g4, and yeah, the form pawn is now, it looks in conjunction with its fellow g pawn to be saying to this bishop, you're not going to be doing much either soon. We have bishop going back to h8. There's no reverse gear this way. The queen can't move without dropping the bishop. So it's awkward. This bishop is already awkward. So bishop h8, e4, and there's an ominous e5 now. Black didn't do anything about the d7 bishop, so why would it do anything about the h8 bishop? It seems that fire is not so much on fire here in this game in terms of bishop dynamism. It's just allowing this other bishop to be hemmed in now. And the price of liberation now is far too high if f6 is played here. It's already too high. This is not played. Rook a1 is played. If liberation with f6, we can work out the price with this variation. E takes, there's a backward pawn which can be attacked like this. As an example, this is just a fictional game example now, just to show that, yeah, because of c6 pressure now, say that bishop has to be given up, and then there's a g7 issue, and then there's tactics which just favour white, for example, bishop a6. Black's just getting overloaded in this position. This is just a fictional game example where the form pawn wins in this endgame. So it's pretty unpleasant to play f6 basically. Basically the targeting of e6 and the form pawn in the endgame, it's just too much, and the c6 pawn being a liability. So we have actually rook a1, g5. So yes, the pawns can be the fundamental constraint of the pieces, and look at these bishops. They're just not happy. These are two of the unhappiest bishops so far in the Premier Division 2019 of TSEC. Yes, very, very miserable bishops. And in fact, this knight has this luxury. It can choose which colour to be on, and it can choose the most sadistic square. And in this pawn structure, with lots of pawns on dark squares, there are lots of juicy holes here. For example, b6, d6, f6. But if we order that by the most centralised juicy hole, we might arrive at d6 as being the tastiest destination with the best weather. So an octopus knight, you might call it. We have queen a7, queen e3, queen a5, and the knight does head off on holiday to d6. Queen b4. We have rook b3, queen a5, queen c3. White really doesn't mind the exchange of queens. Black decides against it. If queen takes c3, which was one of black's only active pieces, we can see that white could sort of entrench a knight on d6, bring the king over in this fictional game, take the a file and march the king to b6, and in conjunction with bishop e4, this is a very simple plan which will be winning because black's totally overloaded. That's just end of game there in that scenario. Yeah, this a5 can always be a useful entry point to black's position. There aren't that many entry points. a5 is one of them for the king in the endgame here. We have queen a7, rook b1. Knight b1 is, I thought, was interesting as a side note, by the way. It seems queen a2 might be nifty to go to d5 later. So black can avoid the mass exchanges and still have the queen on, which might be annoying. But still, technically, white's doing well there. So rook b1 was played. Rook a3, bishop b3, queen e7, knight e4 protecting g5, queen d8. Okay, keeping an eye on g5 for the moment, so the knight can't yet move. Queen d2 protects g5, so the knight can go to its favourite holiday destination and arrives there, knight d6. Octopus knight on holiday. Queen c7, bishop d1. We have queen a5, offering the exchange of queens now voluntarily. Have things got that bad that now black is now offering the exchange of queens? Well, it is pretty miserable. There's lots and lots of nice juicy ideas here, like bishop f3. So yeah, the queen's the queen exchange was offered. Leela took that up, and now king f3, king e2, moving the king over here. Not minding if black takes on f2 here, because rook a1, rook a7 looks absolutely crushing, or rook a8, sort of skewing both bishops. You can imagine both bishops skewed if that bishop moves, that bishop drops off. So we have bishop d7, bishop c2, king f8, king comes to c3, rook a8, king b2. We get the idea. Rook a1 might be of interest. It's not actually played. Rook e1, rook e3, rook f3. This is really, really nifty. It's sort of bribing, persuading the rook to move off the a file, just to take this a file. So not wanting a rook exchange on the a file, which might still be winning because of the king a5 plan, but instead getting a rook in on the a file. And this is pure desperation now. The price of liberation here is far, far too high. It's an entire piece. Black decides that is the lesser evil of the position. That's how bad this is positionally. This game reminds me, it's kind of a mirror image of Lasca Capablanca. There's a famous Lasca Capablanca game where Lasca voluntarily gave up his bishop on c6 in an early Roy Lopez exchange. I'll try and put a link to that video in the pinned comments. And then later he entrenched a knight on e6, not d6. And then later used the h file, not the a file. But it was equally visually compelling, visually crushing like this. And I'm really heartwarmed to see all the comments of such a positional crush being really appreciated in the TSEC chat for this game. This is just a positional masterclass game, teaching us new ideas, really, because many grandmasters, I'm sure, are aware of the c5 blockade plan to kill the c8 bishop, but the h8 bishop with the form pawn, this is kind of new stuff for how to destroy bishops, surely. So anyway, f6 is played. If rook b8, as an example, rook a7, and now, for example, bishop e4, threatening bishop takes c6. This is just bad news. The king just, a very simple plan is the king just going to a5. The king can't move away from f7. So say we don't play king d8, say bishop e8. The king just marches in. And this b4 is too slow. For example, here, knight c4. And then and then the c pawn's going to run, the knight stopping the pawn, and then knight b6 after. That's totally hopeless for black. So we have f6, g takes, yep, piece up, f3 protecting the f pawn with the rook on a3, and now okay, the d pawn is shielded. e5, this is just pure desperation, it seems. Well, black is a piece down, so I don't think we can expect too much from the black position here. So the rook comes to protect e5, and the bishop moves out of the way of the c-pawn. That c-pawn is pretty deadly here. And Flashy giving up the exchange for c7. There's a slight concern. Does Leela know how to mate with bishop and knight? Slight insecurity there. But we do have adjudication rules, so that's not going to be tested anyway, because both engines thought this was absolutely winning for white, and it was ended here. However, let's see if it continued. Did Leela have to try and mate with bishop and knight? Not really, actually. It turns out knight e8, the king stopped from going to that pawn for a bit. So say king e4, knight f6, king e5, knight takes, and that pawn's going to be queening. We can keep the h pawn on, basically. Let's have a look at that again. Say b4, bishop d7, king f4, knight f6, king g5, trying to get the h pawn to test Leela's bishop and knight mating skills. Not needed. Knight g8 protects the h pawn. Bishop e6, bishop f5, zugzwang kind of thing, taking on h7, keeping the king out. Bishop comes back, and it's going to be easy to queen that h pawn. So we have a positional masterclass here from the TSEC Premier Division. Let that be a scary tell to all of you in positional openings. This is why d4 is such a good opening. In the Fischer era, e4 was all the rage, popularized, I expect, a lot by Fischer and others. But d4 often lends itself to positions such as these structures where you've got to be extremely careful how you manage your bishops, how they shouldn't be contained and restricted by their own pawn structure. Here we see it vividly on both sides of the board, two bishops being really destroyed, a knight going to a dream destination in the centre. The A-file use was dream exploitation, not content with just swapping off rooks, distracting the rook and then taking that file. Beautiful stuff. If you enjoyed this game video, please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net. Play against other YouTubers. You can also check the YouTube analysis in advance for these games from the Improve menu. Learn from the Masters YouTube order button. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell. Really appreciate it. And also check out the new Teespring store in the description for your form pawn, especially your form pawn and other t-shirts. As we see, there are new exciting things the form pawn can do. It's as versatile as the cats. Okay, thanks very much.